Good evening, and welcome to tonight's College Scholar presentation. I'm Jim Leiker, Professor of History, and I'm Chair of the History and Political Science Department. I have the honor of introducing tonight's speaker. In the words of Yogi Berra, this feels like deja vu all over again, since it was just a few months ago that Dr. Edwards introduced my presentation from this very podium. So in keeping with one of the themes of her research, I'm aware of the importance of reciprocity. As in most things, when I try to follow Ty, I come away feeling like I could have done a little bit better. That's one reason why I enjoy working with her, and she challenges me to improve. I hope I do the same for her. Before joining the JCCC faculty in 2010, Dr. Edwards had already accumulated an impressive record as a scholar and teacher. She holds a Bachelor in Business Administration from KU, and an MA in History from George Mason University in Virginia. Her doctoral dissertation, Osage Gender, Continuity, Change, and Colonization, which forms the template for her talk tonight, was defended with honors. These past 8 years, Ty has proven herself an exceptional colleague and professor. She offers courses in United States and North American Indian history, and starting next year, Women in U.S. History. She has revitalized our internship program through the mentoring of students in public history projects, championed better methods for assessment and program review, and formerly served as liaison for our College Now partners. Over this past year, she has assumed the directorship of JCCC's Kansas Studies Institute. As the founder of that program almost a decade ago, I could not have asked for a more talented and committed successor. However, it is not her service to the college that brings us here. Rather, it is her growing reputation as an author and researcher. Since the 2013 publication of her award-winning article, Disruption and Disease, The Osage Struggle to Survive in the 19th Century Trans-Missouri West, Ty has attracted national attention for her work on the intersections of gender, disease, and indigenous studies. She is currently collaborating with Professor Paul Kelton on an article for the Journal of American History and has spoken extensively at academic conferences, local civic events, public radio, and in 2015, C-SPAN's American History TV.
Yeah.
Tonight's event is well-timed since it follows the recent publication of her book with University of Kansas Press, Osage Women and Empire. Employing innovative sources and methodologies drawn from multiple disciplines, the book, in the words of one reviewer, refutes the long-standing false stereotype of the male domination and abuse of women in Great Plains warrior societies, and in my own words, moves us to an understanding of the significant but to date underexamined role of gender in resisting settler colonialism. I'm not sure she'll explore this specifically tonight, but what strikes me in Ty's book is the complementarity of dual gender roles in the way Osages understand nature. Forgive me if this is too much information for you, but a few weeks ago, one morning about 4 a.m., when sleep eluded me, I enjoyed from my patio the sight of the female moon and the male sun as they conceived a new day. You know, I've seen sunrises before, but I wouldn't have thought about that one that way if I hadn't been reading Osage Women and Empire the night before. Dr. Edwards' work is a model for what all educators should strive to accomplish: to challenge assumptions and perceive the mundane in new, exciting ways that stimulate the imagination and, in so doing, enrich human life. As I wrote in a recommendation letter for her a while back, Ty has been a transformative force for our department and the college. If we could hire a dozen more like her, we could do revolutionary things, but then one like her is about as lucky as any institution is going to get. If you haven't heard her speak before, I envy you the first-time experience. Please welcome Dr. Ty Edwards.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you. Nice. All right. Well, I'm glad Jim covered some of my stuff. Is this on? Can you hear me? Yeah? Yes. Okay. All right. So I'm going to try to move fast because it turns out covering my whole book in an acceptable period of time is difficult. All right? So I'm going to try that. All right. So let's start with where we are. We're in Kansas. This is the longtime homeland of people whose name our state bears, the Kansas. I am the Kansas Studies Institute Director, but I'm not employed by the Kaw Nation. I'm employed by Johnson County Community College in Johnson County, Kansas. And Thomas Johnson, slave owner and missionary to the Shawnee, who were actually coastal Atlantic people, who ended up concentrated and confined here because of colonization. This county and college bear his name because when colonization forced another expulsion of the Shawnee, he, like many missionaries, received portions of their land as compensation for his work. We've retained the place names, Johnson, Shawnee, Shawnee Mission, and Kansas in this region. What we have not retained is knowledge of colonization. And that's what I'm interested in. Colonization, past and present. The Academy and scholars like myself have also been agents of colonization, replicating and justifying these hierarchies in their work and workplaces. Even though that is not my intent, I am confident I have not shed all the baggage that white Americans carry. And in the discipline of history generally and indigenous history specifically, if you don't think your work is going to be revised, replaced, updated, or entirely refuted in the future, then you're in the wrong profession. In many cases, and very much so with the Osage, many indigenous scholars have actually spent decades writing their own history. And not only is this an act of decolonization in and of itself, but the source material can counter colonial biases in the text. So I use these authors frequently, and you're going to hear about some of them in a minute. This is just some of them. You'll notice it's almost half and half men and women, too, which I think is not coincidental. And I do want to point out that one of them is our colleague here at JCCC, Ed Smith, who is an Osage scholar himself. All right, and it turns out, though, that colonial bias was actually what first interested me in this project. So we got to set a few things up. So gender is what I deal with in the book, okay, right? So Osage Women, Empire, gender. All right, so in case it's been a while since you've learned this, gender is a construction. So societies construct for themselves how many genders there are, the power relations between them, and the acceptable behaviors for each and every society. Okay, so you're probably comfortable with how gender is constructed in our society, but the way gender is constructed in Osage society is different. So let me read. The Osage priesthood organized Osage life based on the dual masculine and feminine forces they observed in celestial and seasonal cycles, like what Jim was telling us about when he introduced. Rituals required both male and female participation and defined a sexual division of labor without hierarchical difference. Spiritually, two things were necessary for continued national existence. One, women creating, and two, men protecting and providing. This meant women created future citizens, food, trade goods, and all the domestic items. Men killed game animals and enemies in warfare. Therefore, men and women worked together to guarantee the nation's future. Because of their different roles, each gender achieved status and power in distinct ways. Women were born with it, and men had to earn it. But life was not as strictly divided as one might think. In order for hunting to produce anything, men had to kill and women had to process. Warfare required male valor, but women ritually combined their courage with men's, and both were credited in victories. Men held political leadership positions as chiefs, but their authority was subordinate to the priesthood, which incorporated women in a variety of ways. In other words, men and women collaborated in virtually everything, and very little could be strictly divided into separate spheres. Okay, so let me review a little bit of that with you. So for the Osage, they operated under a system of gender complementarity. That means not gender hierarchy, which is probably the system you're used to in American culture. And for the Osage, gender complementarity was something they observed in nature. That's something that they saw in the world around them and thus tried to emulate in their spiritual practices. So this is embedded in spirituality and ritual, which were part of everyday life. So daily prayers is a big part of it. Jim was referring to that. So for the Osage in this period that I'm studying, morning, noon, and dusk were when they had prayers because those are following the sun and the moon on their paths. Hunting and war preparation, of course, corn planting, corn harvesting, birth, death, all kinds of aspects of daily life were wrapped up in ritual. And actually, if you go back to this picture, you can see Wachite, who's pictured in this picture. It might be a little hard for you to see, but if you can see the picture, the parting of her hair is painted red. And Osage women would paint the parting of their hair red to follow the path of the sun in their daily prayers every day, and you can see that in her image. Okay, so men and women. Women were considered the channel through whom all human life must proceed and continue. And in the Osage conception, this was a mystic, sacred power of creating human life, which was almost identical in their conception to how human life was created in general. Okay? So women were creators, much like mystical great powers or Wakanda. Okay, so women do that same work. And then their work, therefore, as I kind of laid out already, is reproductive, creative, and life-giving, and full of things that you would expect. But the raising of crops is one I want to point out specifically. Osage women were farmers, and they viewed the growing of corn as identical to the growing of humans. So you take seeds, right, semen and corn, spend time nurturing, wait, and then to fruition you have humans and food. So that was considered spiritually the same kind of work. All right, so men. Men, the life granted by Wakanda must be protected. The woman, the children she bears, the home she builds for their shelter and comfort, the fields she cultivates must be guarded. The land upon which the tribe depends for plant and animal food must be held against invasion, and the life of the individual and the tribe must at all times be defended from enemies. So this is an English translation of Osage language rituals repeated in the early part of the 20th century. Francis LaFlèche was an Omaha man who actually spoke a dialect of the Omaha language that was mutually intelligible with Osage. So in the early part of the century, the federal government paid him to go and interview Osage leaders and record their spiritual beliefs. What's interesting about him is because he was Native himself, he could record these in Native languages. He has all these old, they were called dictaphone recordings that he did with Osage leaders. One thing that made him unusual for the time is he also actually interviewed women, which most of the federal agents that do this are white, and they almost never interviewed women. And so these are his English translations from those recordings that he made in the early part of the century. And then, of course, the work men did is somewhat predictable. Providing, protecting, and life-taking. So it's important to note the difference between life-giving and life-taking. So women in many ways cannot be associated with the activities that involve life-taking because they are physically creators, right? They are literally physically and spiritually conditioned for creation. All right, so in terms of my book, my argument is that gender was deeply embedded in the Osage worldview and spirituality. And it animated their lives and experiences, and their survival and success required men and women. But as you remember in the thing I was just reading, I talked about how the spheres weren't as separate as you might think. So here's some of the things that we might stereotype as being one gender's work, but it's really multiple gender work. So I wrote there in the subtitle, Spirituality and the Economy Embodied this Gender Complementarity. So the most obvious way is alternative genders. When I told you gender is a construction, right, and I said societies decide how many genders there are, a common feature of Native North America is the belief that there are more than two genders. And in some cases, it's hard to actually count after that because there was space in their societies for people to live part-time in one gender and part-time in another gender. Again, this is spiritually sanctioned and defined. So this multiple gender paradigm is really normal in Native North America, and the Osage are no exception to this. So this is one of the examples where, and the way I usually explain it to my students is if you think about the Earth, right, it has a north and south pole, and if you think of those poles as gender roles, there's polarization, but there is the plane between, right, and there are people that exist in those places between. All right, so cooking, right, women prepared meals, but sometimes they were too busy or men were off without them, so the men didn't starve to death, they cooked for themselves. Agriculture, women did all the farming and they owned the produce of their fields. However, men could do some of the work in the field if he was under the direction of a woman on what to do and how to do it. This matters later because missionaries who see men in the fields think, we did it! They're civilized! We changed their culture! No, they're doing something they've always done. And this is in that context. So men had been in fields in various ways, but it's under the direction of women. Okay, hunting. This is what first sort of spawned my idea of what this project was, is because I was increasingly getting the impression that we think of hunting as a native male task, but nothing good comes from rotting dead carcasses, so something else must happen after they kill those things. And women turned carcasses into food and trade items. War, again, war's another thing stereotyped as male. So men physically fought, but in Osage society, women were ritually part of that. In fact, in some cases, you even see Osage scholars who are calling women the source of male bravery because of the way they raise their sons. So there's a lot of roles of women in this. Women often controlled the sacred objects that were part of war, so they cared for them, and men had to appeal to women to actually take them with them on war expeditions. Diplomacy, men held political leadership role as chiefs, but women contributed through hospitality and feast preparation, which typically went on with everything. And even Europeans eventually get to the point where they talk about The hospitality of Osage women and Osage communities is so overwhelming that it really does alleviate conflict. Like after you go to 15 houses and eat amazing food and are treated with sort of hospitality, that it really does have a pacifying effect. And then the priesthood. Of course, priesthood is a bad English word, right? That might not be a good equivalent here, but spiritual leadership is what I'm referring to. Preeminent in all matters, so this is another thing, chiefly power, as you might think of it, was subservient to spiritual power. And in order for a man to become a so-called priest, he had to be married, and he and his wife were initiated together. And then if he died, his widow could fulfill his role, which I think is interesting because the reverse was not the case, so far as I can tell. And it appears there's numerous references to women fulfilling so-called priestly roles independently. And there are some of the rituals that I'm referring to that Francis Lafeche never got to recording, and they were the ones that more significantly involved women. So it's questionable of what role women had in maybe primary roles in even those activities. So again, I'm arguing gender is deeply embedded in their worldview. It's animating all of their behavior. And then as this slide shows, women and men cooperated. Okay, so if things from the Osage perspective are successful, it's because men and women are doing their jobs together and effectively. Okay, so their idea of success is collaborative based on gender. I'm also arguing that gender is a central site of experiencing and resisting colonization. And colonization will intentionally assault gender and gender roles. And so this is going to be a big part of how the Osage and all indigenous people experience colonization. So I argue that as long as their spirituality and the economy that comes from this, which was an agricultural, hunting, trading economy, if those things are intact, then the gender complementarity that underlays it remains intact. That's my primary argument. Okay, so what's going on? All right, so the Osage are credited as having a post-colonial empire. So in the early decades of colonization, especially during the French and Spanish colonial period, the Osage are credited with having an empire. And so you can see the space that they supposedly controlled that's smaller, and then the larger space that they control later. So they have an expansive power that grows over this period. Okay, so this is where we get into what first interested me in this project. Once the French built trading posts along the periphery of Osage territory in the 1720s, the Osage became middlemen in exchanges between the French and more western and southern indigenous communities. French traders attempted to initiate trade relations with western and southern native groups. However, the Osage prevented, violently if necessary, any threats, both native and European, to their position as middlemen. Taking advantage of their large population, estimates range from 10 to 18,000, and their resource-rich location between the Mississippi River and the Prairie Plains, the Osage became the primary economic and military power in western Louisiana. As historian Kathleen Duval put it, the Osage proved far more successful than either France or Spain at building a mid-continental empire. Studies of the Osage Empire's rise and fall have almost entirely emphasized the lives of men as hunters, warriors, traders, and political leaders. This is a common bias in the historiography of war, diplomacy, and politics, topics often associated with the masculine sphere in Euro-American and Native societies. Scholarship examining the adaptability, creativity, and skill with which indigenous people built such empires has typically also concentrated on men, implying that women had little to do with men or tribal hegemony, especially if expanded power resulted from increased war or trade. Unfortunately, without more in-depth knowledge of the Osage gender construction, one could misinterpret their imperial growth as elevating men's status and correspondingly reducing that of women. As Kathleen Duval concluded in her book, men's value had changed Osage history. While women's economic importance remained strong, their place probably became less central than in the past. In sum, the Osage Empire ostensibly resulted from men's hunting and warrior success, undermining gender complementarity. So when I was reading that book, and Kathleen Duval's book is a great book, it's called Native Ground, and it's about the power of natives in the center of the continent, even well after colonization. But when I was reading that book, the first time I was ever reading it, I got to that page where it said, women's place probably became less central than in the past. And it's right at the end of a chapter, so you're like, I want to know more. Oh, it's over. And that's why I was like, I find that doubtful. Why would you abandon your gender construction if you believe everything that is necessary for success is housed in gender and you are suddenly successful? You would have to do that in the way that made sense to be successful to you. And I was also suspicious that there's this underlying bias in scholarship that supposedly Native men are kind of waiting for Euro-American men to come and liberate them from these powerful women they have to live with all the time. Like, that's how it read to me. And I just didn't think that someone from a culture that has gender complementarity would ever see it that way, right? It would seem like you would inherently be not successful if you didn't have men and women doing it together. Okay, so what's going on in this empire? So the Osage have a trade empire, which is how they become very powerful and wealthy in this period. All right, the thing they're trading in the highest volume is deer skins. They are the most prolific traders of this item in the region. And when I say they're doing a lot, like, I'm not kidding. So let's see, let me give you some numbers here. So men will spend about double or triple the amount of time they used to spend hunting in the 1700s, and they will procure enough hides and meat to occupy multiple women for days or weeks at a time. Typically, women were processing 20 medium-sized hides, and about 20 could buy a musket. One medium hide could buy a horn full of powder or 2 pounds of bullets. A dressed deerskin typically weighed about 1 to 2 pounds, and depending on the size of the animal. Packs or bales of these skins weighed approximately 100 pounds. So you're dealing with, right, 50 to 100-ish animals in that pack. From 1764 to 1803, the Osage produced more than half of the hides in Spanish Illinois, amounting to roughly 600 packs of skins per year, or over 20,000 packs in total. As a result, they became the best armed Indians on the Central Plains, furthering their military and hide trade dominance. U.S. officials calculated the illegal Osage trade at just one post for the final 4 years of Spanish rule involved tens of thousands of skins valued at $20,000 then, $400,000 today. And during that same period, the Little and Great Osage produced $43,000 worth of furs, which is over $800,000 today, which is an enormous volume of hunting and hide processing for men and women to conduct. Other things they trade in are horses. If you've read anything about indigenous history, for indigenous people to adopt livestock, this usually requires a gender reorganization, because who's going to care for the animals? And whose spiritual work is that? So for the Osage, what they do is that there's not a lot of evidence that they were intentionally breeding the horses to have self-sustaining herds, and instead they would raid from other individuals. So of course those individuals would claim they were stolen, or they'd hunt the wild horse herds that were along the Red or Cimarron River in this period. And so what that means is men could acquire horses in the same way they acquired other things. So they didn't have to reorder gender. And it appears that young boys were the ones who tended the herds when they were near the community. So of course you had to keep the horses out of women's fields, because that's where they would, of course, want to eat. Slaves. The other thing the Osage traded in were slaves, indigenous slaves, which the French were always very excited to trade with, because these were highly valuable commodities to the French. They would use them in their local French colonies, but they also would traffic a lot of indigenous slaves to the Caribbean. And this is all over the continent, this is happening. So slave trading for indigenous people, generally, Osage specifically, it's the same. It's captives taken in war is normal, right? That had existed long before colonization. And in indigenous contexts, captives taken in war were often adopted into the community in which they were captive in, or traded to a third nation, and then adopted into that nation over time. So the way we look at this is trading captives is an act of life-giving, which is an excellent way to end war, which is usually about life-taking, right? So captive exchange was something that went on in indigenous North America, but captives usually ended up in other indigenous communities. So for the continent, the indigenous population doesn't really overall change, right? Some natives are living in different nations, but they're not necessarily overall changing the indigenous population. Once the French arrive, that changes, because indigenous people are either in French households, and eventually in a generation or two don't identify as indigenous anymore because of the identity erasure that comes from that isolation, or they're trafficked to the Caribbean, right, where they also experience identity erasure, or if you've been in a Caribbean colony in the 1700s, you're probably gonna die. So these are things that actually then deplete the indigenous population on the continent in ways that captive exchange before this had never done. And actually, because the French wanted to consume so many slaves, this encourages native-on-native warfare to obtain them. So if we like when you're teaching American history, the reason why right now we're not speaking French in this area is because the French destabilized their native allies by engaging in the slave trade. Had they have not done that, their power on the continent might have been a lot different in their clashes with other empires. But they do, they engage in the slave trade. All right, so social changes. If you're going to have this kind of regional power, some things are going to have to change in your society to accommodate it. Some of the things that go on is decentralization of the nation. So you can see it says Little Osage, Great Osage, Arkansas Osage. Those are just regional definitions. You're going to have lots of Osage cities and towns inside each of those areas. And this decentralization allows them to control larger areas. And towns then more towns means more opportunities for leadership for the people that live in those towns. So you have more and more successful people, more and more leadership opportunities in said towns, right? So this is a way to allow people success. And then in terms of gender, one thing that changes in this period is the Osage seem to go from patrilocal residents to matrilocal residents. So the Osage are patrilineal descent, right? So you get your clan identity from father. And then typically with that is patrilocal residence, right? You live with patrilineal relatives. In this period, they switched to matrilocal residents with still patrilineal descent, which is unusual in Native North America. And the reason they would have done that, it seems, is because hunting and war parties were made up of one clan's men. And so a household might be without all of their men for extended periods if they were on a hunting or war expedition, which would engender, that would be a problem for food, that would be a problem for protection. But if you change to matrilocal residence, you have the men of that household are from different clans. It's the women that share the clan. And so that way, the household is never without its food production and protection for any one time. And then what goes along with that is women also need help with all this hide processing and meat processing they're doing. And so female units were a common unit that were doing that labor together. And it's not surprising with this change, you also see the rise of plural marriages. Americans call this polygamy or polygyny. And in American society, this is often associated with exploitation of women, sexual exploitation of women, dependency of women, subordination of women. But that's not the case if you're in a society that doesn't tie marriage and sex together, which was the case here. And if you're in a society where sexual freedom is normal for adults, period, and where divorce is freely had, and the economic proceeds of your labor belong to you, which was all the case here, right? So women still controlled their labor, their produce, their sexual relations, their bodies, and if they choose to marry elsewhere, that can be had. So what does this look like? Oh, and marrying French traders. Usually when we think of natives who are super successful at trade, we think of Europeans, especially French men, marrying native women. And that doesn't happen for the Osage until the 1760s. So in other words, they can build this empire without even bothering to integrate French people into the nation. And the reason why they can pull that off is because of their power in the region. But in the 1760s, as you know, the French are, at least officially, eliminated from the continent, right? After the 7 Years' War or the so-called French and Indian War, the French are supposedly eliminated. So in that sort of cultural and imperial contest change, you see prominent Osage women start marrying French traders who are the French that are left, right, after their empire also leaves the continent. This is when you see the growth of St. Louis, which was intentionally an Osage trading town, and then those connections being made to solidify that power. All right, so this, in other words, to sum it up, is a super successful time. So let me show you how successful I'm talking about. Warning, there's an American with some cultural bias in this. In August 1811, Fort Osage factor George Sibley observed 1,000 people in an Osage hunting camp in the full and free indulgence of all the luxuries of their rude condition. He noted an absence of illness and abundance of supplies, including buffalo, elk, deer, marrow bones, tongues, hominy beans, dried pumpkin plums, and other dainties. Men's hunting and women's meat production, cultivation, and gathering produced this bounty. Vigilant elder warriors maintained camp security, while elder women were busy employed jerking and curing on scaffolds the flesh of the fat buffalo. Young men and women adorned in the highest style of fashion mingled in small groups. Older boys tended the horses, many girls aided their mothers, and swarms of children swam in the creek or frolicked on the prairie. Sibley concluded, mirth and hearty merriment prevailed. Never had I witnessed such general happiness in any community as prevailed here. These observations demonstrate how even after a century of colonization, in many ways, Osage life continued to follow a familiar and clearly flourishing cycle. And this is 1811. So the question is, what's changed, right? What changes over time? All right, what will change as Americans? All right, so what will change as Americans? So here you see this is 1800s to 1830s generally. Something to notice, I'm going to mention this in a minute. You see other indigenous nations on the east there. So Sac and Fox, Kickapoo, Delaware, Shawnee, Cherokee. These are new populations moving in. Okay, so why are new populations moving in? The U.S. empire's impact on the Osage. Okay, I got to back up in case you hadn't yet reconciled that the U.S. was an empire. All right, so the United States acted as an empire towards indigenous people from its founding. And the U.S., unlike some empires, is called a settler empire. All right, there's different kinds of empires. But a settler empire is an empire that intends to remove the indigenous population in order for the empire's settlers to possess that land. And the only way you can do that is by eliminating indigenous people. Okay, so settler colonial empires need indigenous elimination. Now there's numerous ways you can eliminate people. You can literally kill them, and that's genocide. Right? You can remove them, which is what Americans like to call it, but that's ethnic cleansing, right? When you expel certain ethnic groups from regions. There's also missionization and assimilation, right? Which is attempting to eliminate culture so that people and their descendants no longer identify as that group, and that culture and that people is therefore effectively eliminated. All right, so these are all strategies of a settler empire. Settler empires need native elimination. Okay, so post-American Revolution, the American Revolution for many Americans is going to be about getting access to native land, and as a result, natives are going to have to flee or, again, be eliminated in other ways. So what this leads to is what we would call refugees, all right, moving out of places where they're being expelled, and some of them, or at least, are moving into where the Osage live. It's highly fertile, it's full of valuable resources, and they are encroaching. And as more natives move into the region, this is competition, right, with the Osage for the natural resources that exist there. Okay, so that competition is going to be difficult. And then we get to my favorite president, not Jefferson. Yeah, warning, anyone who's taken my classes knows this already. All right, so speaking of how this works for the Osage land technically, right, by the view of Americans, becomes part of the United States thanks to the Louisiana Purchase. We've all heard about the Lewis and Clark thing. I don't need to see the signs by the highway anymore, but I guess other people still like to see them. The Osage visit Jefferson and Washington, it says there. Well, let me read this and then I'll tell you why they do that. All right, so though George Washington proposed it in the 1780s and Andrew Jackson infamously championed it in the 1830s, Thomas Jefferson was actually the first person to formulate an official federal policy of removal, the first to set it in motion, the first to start removing tribes west of the Mississippi. His intention for the Louisiana Purchase was to expand upon the native migration already in progress by formally relocating all eastern native nations into the new territory. Though American historians have antiseptically labeled this the removal period, historian John McFarriger, among many others, has argued this was more accurately the era of ethnic cleansing. In a settler empire, and this is important, these removed peoples served as proxy invaders, warring with locals like the Osage, and eventually decimating all. After eastern land was filled with American settlers, Jefferson expected the United States to establish additional states in the Louisiana Territory. So Jefferson was definitely a settler colonial implementer. He is ready for natives to be eliminated long-term from the pieces of land that the United States controls. All right, so when Lewis and Clark go on their little trip, one of the things they are supposed to do is have relatively positive relations with natives in order to smooth the way for this American settler empire to move after them. And one of the ways Jefferson wants this to happen is for Lewis and Clark to send native leaders back to Washington to meet him. And the Osage are the first people Lewis and Clark sent to do that, because the Osage live right where Jefferson wants to remove other natives, and he needs the Osage to be acquiescing to his will. So they visit Jefferson and Washington in 1804, and then this becomes standard practice in U.S. Indian policy from here on out. You invite natives to Washington, D.C., they get to meet the president gives them a medal or something, and then natives get to tour military installations. I think the Osage went to Annapolis on this trip. So they get to see the military power of the United States. They get to see the population of the United States, and the intent is intimidation. And other scholars argue that it worked on the Osage because they don't ever outright implement war against the U.S. military and other sort of U.S. official entities. And so that's the argument for why this supposedly, quote unquote, worked. Still in Jefferson's presidency, 1807 to 08, you already have American settlements west of St. Louis. From the Osage perspective, they're squatters. Okay, they are living on Osage land illegally, and this is how it typically worked. Settler colonialism also rests very heavily on the economic desperation of the settlers. So why are people moving out into Missouri past St. Louis? Because they're probably going to face Osage attacks, right? Because they're living on Osage land, right? From the Osage perspective, they're stealing Osage natural resources. The reason why they do this is because they're economically desperate. And for them, land ownership is the way that you improve your status and solidify your status. And so they are willing to take on that danger in order to get that wealth. So the way historian Alan Taylor tells it, describing this, is in American history, one person's freedom came at another's expense. So these individuals squatting on this land are achieving freedom for themselves, but the way they're doing that is by denying that same freedom to indigenous people. And that's how settler empires work. All right, so Jefferson is still president. He's so busy. He does so much awful stuff. Back to Jefferson. All right, so the Treaty of 1808 is the big Osage Treaty with the United States. Jefferson is president. Lewis and Clark, I mean, they know where they're going now, so they obviously have to be in the federal government. Lewis is territorial governor of Upper Louisiana, which included where the Osage lived, and Clark is now the general of militia and the superintendent of Indian Affairs at St. Louis. The Treaty of 1808 was a classic example of treaty coercion. As Jefferson had instructed, Clark abruptly demanded land cessions when Osage leaders thought they were meeting to discuss other matters. In this case, invasion and retaliation against American settlers. Negotiations were only conducted with a few Great and Little Osage leaders who did not have the authority to make land cessions, and the entire nation, Arkansas bands included, was expected to abide by the treaty's provisions. And finally, Clark flatly lied about what was in the treaty. He allegedly admitted to a friend that it was the hardest bargain against the Indians he ever made, and that if he was to be damned hereafter, it would be for making that treaty. The Osage leaders were led to believe that they had agreed to share some territory with Euro-American hunters in exchange for annuity payments, goods, blacksmith services, plows, a grain mill, a trading factory, and federal military protection against rival natives. However, Clark, Lewis, and Jefferson claimed that Osage had ceded their title to an extent of country nearly equal to the state of Virginia and much more fertile, on which refugee natives and Americans would settle. Osage leaders were already voicing their displeasure to Lewis about the fraudulent acquisition of 52 million acres before he had even mailed the treaty to the president. But it was to no avail. Osage historian Lewis Burns concluded, considering that all forms of compensation for these lands totaled less than 1/6 of a cent per acre, it is reasonable to suspect that someone was cheated. Osage complaints were irrelevant because Jefferson had already set in motion a plan that by 1810 had settled 1,000 Cherokee on Osage land. By 1820, the local Cherokee population reached 5,000. Of all the eastern natives moving into the region, the large, well-armed Cherokee population was the most serious threat to date to Osage access to game and the trade wealth it produced. The Cherokee also created alliances with Osage rivals, cooperated to steal Osage horses, attacked hunting parties, raided food storage caches, and burned agricultural fields. Though William Clark had promised federal protection for the Osage in the Treaty of 1808, it was not forthcoming. While natives killed each other, U.S. military protection was reserved for the tens of thousands of American settlers colonizing the region. As Jefferson had intended, Indian policy ultimately functioned to facilitate American access to land continent-wide. Hence, William Clark, now serving as territorial governor of Missouri, Secretary of War John Calhoun, and President James Monroe, preferred to make arrangements favorable to the Cherokees, as the president is anxious to hold out every inducement to the Cherokees and other southern nations of Indians to immigrate to the west of the Mississippi. Thus, the Osage were punished for warshare with the Cherokee, culminating in another land cession treaty in 1818 that was deliberately misleading, not negotiated with the necessary leaders, and its promises never fulfilled. By 1825, thousands of American settlers squatted on Osage lands, and as had been the tradition for decades, Osage leaders were forced to accept whatever payment U.S. officials offered before they lost the land completely. The result was expulsion to Kansas, and the Osage presence in their eastern homeland was effectively eliminated. And that's in about 20 years. So when I teach American colonialism, what I have to tell my students is Americans are much more efficient at it. They are much more efficient than the French, much more efficient than the British at settler colonizing and eliminating indigenous people. And you can see that here. So by 1825, the Osage are expelled into what we would today call Kansas. It was Indian Territory then. All right, so the Osage in Kansas, 1830s to the 1860s. I'll show you another map that shows where this is in the larger state in a second. So what does this involve? Okay, so life in Kansas is extremely difficult for the Osage. All right, extremely difficult. So let's go over a couple of reasons why. Okay, so the Osage had been hunting in Kansas for decades. They knew the landscape. What they hadn't been doing there is farming, because it is extremely inhospitable to farming, as Americans will later learn when they try to do it too. So where to live and farm? It takes the Osage 5 years to figure out where to build their villages, trying to find the most fertile land, and the reason why they're having trouble figuring it out, because there's very little fertile land. And what I mean by that is this region is prone to drought, and it is prone to periodic floods that wash away your crops that are planted near the waterways. They also will experience grasshopper infestations that, of course, also eat all the crops. All right, and women are the farmers, right? So this is going to make the work of women that makes them prominent in their society difficult. In fact, it seems like eventually they're just planting in order to maintain the sacred act of it and the spiritual nature that goes with it, because its food provision is very limited. And that's saying something, because through the 1820s, Osage women were farming so successfully that they had surpluses almost every year. And that's while they're doing the scale of hide processing and meat processing we were talking about. Okay, so this is difficult. All right, relying more on hunting, trade, and mobility. So what do you do? All right, so what they do is relied more on hunting, trading, and mobility, but these are things that were established in their culture, right? So again, hunting is something that women and men do together. The trade goods they produce, they are producing together, and they're moving a lot in order to survive in this landscape. Bison herds will be more important than deer by this point in terms of trade and food, one of the inadequacies of that last map I showed you is it didn't show you all the native people to the west, all right? So to the west is, of course, the Comanche Empire, which is one of the most powerful indigenous empires as well. They are extremely good at having access to bison herds and controlling that. And so there will be competition and sometimes war between the Osage and other groups over bison. But of course, what's the real problem going to be? You could have guessed. It was the settler invasion. Okay, so settlers. By the time Congress debated, the greatest challenge the Osage faced in Kansas came from settler colonialism. As early as March 1853, more than a year before the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed, which officially created Kansas Territory, a congressional Indian appropriations bill included an authorization for the President of the United States to enter into negotiations with Indian tribes west of the states of Missouri and Iowa for the purpose of securing the assent of said tribes to the settlement of citizens of the United States upon the lands claimed by said Indians, and for the purpose of extinguishing the title of said Indian tribes in whole or in part to said lands. The goal of native elimination could not have been clearer. The federal government had just signaled to eager speculators and squatters that native land rights in Kansas were temporary. And if settlers wanted access to this newly available land, they should move now. And they did. By the time Congress debated the Kansas-Nebraska Act a year later, natives faced significant settler invasion. One missionary noted that squatters were not very particular about keeping in the lines, never caring about the limits of the Osage Reservation. From this point on, missionaries and government agents documented settlers coming into the region daily, disregarding reservation boundaries, building homes, tilling fields, destroying food sources, stealing horses, and using violence, including murder, to gain Osage land and resources. In fact, one Indian agent indicated that these settlers were even aware of their role as members of the settler empire. When settlers came, they knew they were trespassers, and they had no right whatever to settle where they did, but they were men who wished to fight for their rights. They became very much displeased that the government did not give them each at least a quarter section of this land for the great hardships they had endured amongst those savages, and as a reward for their services in driving the Indians from their homes and the graves of their fathers, and occupying their best lands, which they, the settlers, had no shadow of title to. Speeches delivered by so-called leading men and newspaper articles further convinced settlers that Indians have no rights which should be respected by white men. Settlers generally associated in clubs, pledged to defend each other in occupation of claims, created their own militias, organized at least 3 counties entirely inside the Osage Reservation, and then applied to the territorial governor for protection. All the while, Indian agents repeatedly requested the use of military force to guarantee reservation boundaries and remove squatters. But the neglect of the federal government to assert the supremacy of law over a few bordermen, professional squatters, was regarded as a tacit approval of criminal acts by men professing to be just and honest. Hence, more settlers perpetrated the same crime, claiming the right to do what was allowed by others. Why would the federal government bother enforcing temporary land rights? Congress had already made it clear that natives in Kansas would be eliminated, and if settlers were willing to do the work, why not let them? All of this exhibited the systematic nature of U.S. imperialism. In other words, invasion is a structure, not an event, and therefore elimination is an organizing principle of settler colonial societies rather than a one-off occurrence. And that was the experience in Kansas. The settler invasion was just intense. All right, so in Kansas, living there was really an assault on gendered work. So we've already talked about the difficulty in farming, right? So that in of itself was difficult for women. But then the crops they actually could grow were often stolen. So settlers would steal their dried, stored crops. Then they would actually steal harvests directly from the fields, or they would let their livestock graze in Osage fields. It appears in Kansas that Osage women were in charge of burials, and the Osage would bury their dead with food and other important objects for transition to the afterlife and time in the afterlife. And so Americans would rob those graves of the food and the objects in them. The way I say it in the book is Americans were apparently willing to harass the living or the dead. And from the Osage perspective, then, the dead was suffering, right? Your relative or your friend was suffering, and you were not able to protect them. Dismantling of homes, the Osage women had really nicely built board plank homes. Americans definitely complimented them frequently and then took them. And then theft of horses. Between the 1860s and the 1870s, it's documented that 5 to 20 head a day were being stolen by American settlers from the Osage. Okay, so think about what this is doing. It's assaulting everybody's work, right? All the things that women make, they can't protect and profit from, and men can't protect either, right? This is assaulting work and identity, and they aren't able to keep any of their work safe. All right, and one thing that I'm only going to talk about briefly today, I can talk to you more about it if you want, it's a big part of the book, is missionization, right? This is the effort to culturally eliminate the Osage. The Protestants, this is actually not in Kansas. That's actually before they left Missouri. It starts before they leave Missouri. And then the Catholics missionize the Osage in Kansas. Both groups admit by the time the Osage leave where the missionaries are that they have failed. There's a whole book called Unaffected by the Gospel. It talks about how the Osage religion is so important in their lives and so deeply rooted that missionaries really couldn't even make an adequate plea. They try to focus on children, but they only ever even see a very small proportion of the Osage population. They don't give their children up to missionaries. And if they do, it's only for short periods to learn English. And then usually they retrieve their children. Missionaries were always complaining about how they couldn't keep children in the schools very long if they could get them at all. But what's the intent of missionaries? Cultural assault, right? That's the intent. They're intending to dismantle culture. And especially the later group, the Catholics are federally funded, at least in part, right? So they are agents of the state in this work. And that's why they are frequently criticized for being agents of cultural genocide, including by Osage scholars. However, it's interesting in terms of the Osage because they were missionized by both Protestants and Catholics. They talk about when the Catholics show up that they actually prefer the Catholics to the Protestants because the Protestants came with their own families. And they felt like they were definitely there to benefit their family unit rather than the Osage Nation. And because some of them get land in Missouri as a result, it's hard to dispute that. But the Catholics, of course, don't have families, right? They're nuns and priests who are sort of coming as individual entities. But their ability to convert is also fairly difficult. And there are some great quotes. The Protestants actually talk about how committed the Osage are to their own religion and how they wish that American Christians were as committed to their religious practices and religious faith as the Osage are to their own faith. So they actually lament religious conviction. So what ends up happening, I've got one more map for you here. So the Osage Reservation in Kansas is that sort of rectangular shape. The encroachment I was talking about, you know, those 3 counties that are inside Osage land, that's kind of on the eastern edge there where you see those diagonal lines. The Osage are sort of coerced again into ceding that land that's already occupied by Americans in 1865, and then they're supposed to move further west onto what's called the diminished reservation, but it is immediately overrun by settlers too. Before it's even fully approved by Congress, there are like 70 families living on it, and by the time Congress actually pays for the land, there are 500 families living inside the Osage Reservation, and these are even more violent and militant than the groups before. And so eventually they're expelled from Kansas, and this is a particularly bad situation of fraud, the 1870s supposed treaty. The Commissioner of Indian Affairs comes personally to convince the Osage to do it, and he invites some of the militia settlers to come to the supposed negotiations to intimidate them and threaten them while they're doing it. And then the Osage Reservation in what we would now call Oklahoma was actually inside of Cherokee land. And so the title for the Osage had to be solidified from the Cherokee, and they end up selling their Kansas land, which later is going to be an important aspect of resisting policy and seeking access to proceeds from that land that they will leverage later in their history. But how do we sum all of this up? Okay, so how do we sum all of this up? With all their struggles in Kansas, this should have been the period when the Osage people became culturally or literally extinct. As Patrick Wolf has argued, settler colonialism destroys to replace. The United States needed the elimination of natives in order to establish itself on their territory. The pressure just to survive was intended to make the Osage and all indigenous people acquiesce to demands by federal agents and missionaries to change everything. Osage women should have been subjugated as men became farmers and everyone adopted Christianity, or destruction and despair of it all should have killed them. But that did not happen. Maintaining gendered work and the corresponding religious practices in still relevant ways preserved their social structure that had long used self-directed adaptations to persist and even thrive in a changing world. In Kansas, they made some changes to their economic and ritual practices in light of new circumstances. However, many of the old ways, though severely challenged, were the best methods of survival. In Oklahoma, things were different, and that was where they made more significant changes. Nevertheless, the longevity and solidarity the Osage Nation has today would never have happened if they had become assimilated, sedentary Christian farmers in Kansas. And that's why aspects of gender complementarity still connect the modern Osage with their imperial ancestors. So thank you, and let me know if you have questions. And if you would like to know more about disease, I'll do that next week.
Do you have any questions?
Oh yeah, we do have a microphone. Or I can repeat it. Yes, Andrea.
I'm not going to ask that for you.
Good, because you know the answers.
But I am really curious about what kind of relationships the Osage had with the Kansas.
Right.
And the degree to which these groups are
Separators,
in any way
no.
ethnically
Similar.
related?
Yeah, they are. Yeah, so there's 5 indigenous groups they say have dialects of the same language. So the Kansas, Omaha, Ponca, Osage, and Quapaw, sometimes called the Arkansas. So yeah, they all speak dialects of the same language. And it depends on what scholarship you look at. Some people believe like that the Osage were once part of Cahokia residency. And then the suspicion becomes, if that's the case, then are the other indigenous groups. And oral history bears out their shared history in different places, yeah. And I think by the time we're getting to the Kansas period, Kansas are coming to live with the Osage at various points, and there's a lot of overlap there. And I'd have to look at exactly what year, but in many cases they're living with or right next to the Osage. But of course they eventually will be removed from Kansas too. They do have their own defined reservation in Kansas.
Do they have similar gender relations?
Well, I'd have to look at that, but my assumption is yes. So I've read a lot about the Omaha. And because Francis LaFleche, who did a lot of the work on the Osage spirituality, he also did a lot of work on the Omaha, which were his own people. And yes, there's a lot of overlap there. So my assumption is generally yes. Although to be fair, most indigenous North Americans had gender complementarity. So in terms of actual direct spiritual ties, probably, because they have shared history. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Do you have a feeling for what the population was?
Or do you want me to just repeat the questions? I can do that. Do I have a feeling for what the population was?
Like before the colonization started and then what it became?
Yeah, so generally they think that the 10 to 18,000 maybe was the population at sort of contact, if you will. And I don't know if this is what you're asking, but if you are wondering, like, did they have these 90% death epidemics? The answer is no. And I'll talk about that next week.
Come back next Thursday.
Yeah.
Come back on Thursday to hear
come
about
back
that.
on Thursday for that. Yeah, which was considered at the time sizable, right? So like the region they're living in, that's a really large population, which some people argue is why the Osage were able, once they get access to guns directly or the French directly, that they have this large population they can leverage to this work. And then I would argue, from the Osage perspective, the reason why they have this large population is the power of women and their fertility, which of course is a spiritual blessing that they're able to do that, and it's based on their spiritual relationships that they believe they can accomplish that. But women set them up for success, right? And I didn't get into this, I will get into this next week. By the time they were moved to Oklahoma, we're talking 3,000 people. And most of that death happens in Kansas. So it's a deadly place, yeah.
if there's a marriage between Osage and a French, let's say,
Yeah.
they retain the same sort of.
Oh yeah, so how do these mixed relationships work?
Right.
So the way it tended to work, so these are prominent women that marry traders that are already pretty successful, which isn't always our stereotype. A lot of times we think it's some poor trader marrying some poor woman and she's trying to elevate her status. That's not what's happening here. So these men often were adopted into the Osage Nation because patrilineal descent is clan identity. And some of these men will have multiple Osage partners over the course of their life. They typically had a white wife back in St. Louis. So I do have some stuff on that in the book about fluid marriage ties and what this means for solidifying access to trade. But I think you're asking about the offspring, right? So what does this mean for identity? Americans love to project half-breed identity on indigenous people, that natives don't have that conception. You're either in or you're out. And you see this a lot with the Osage. So they try to intentionally wedge treatment of so-called half-breeds with so-called full-bloods, and they do this by giving more land to so-called half-breeds in treaties, right? So then you'd literally be dividing them, right? So people would stay back for that land, right? And then other populations would leave. So these are artificial things that Americans are imposing on them to try to make that happen. Yeah, so whenever you think of the sort of idea of blood quantum, that's American baggage projected on. Yeah, and so a lot of times what made someone labeled half-blood was what clothes they would wear, or if they spoke multiple languages publicly, rather than their actual descent. Yeah. Yes?
Was there ever any positive relationship between the U.S. military and the natives, or was their main purpose to protect the white settlers?
Well, that was their main purpose, yeah. So we look at forts, for example. It's like when a fort is built, that's a sign of military strength with intention to intimidate. However, I think it depends on which native group you're talking about. So in some cases, like the Osage would go to various forts to try to negotiate peace with the Cherokee, who they were often in conflict with. And the Osage definitely felt like the Cherokee were getting positive treatment and protection from the federal government that the Osage were not getting. I'm not sure if the Cherokee would feel that way because they're not in their homeland anymore, and they might feel that this is sort of the best deal they can get with Americans. But yeah, and there is one guy I quote in here who's the best sort of person I could find in terms of blaming Americans for the suffering that the Osage are experiencing, and he's a military captain. So he's certainly aware of what's going on. And he goes through all the value of land that they lost. He says that this is like a stain on the reputation of Americans, that all of this suffering is on the moral sort of conscience of America, and he's doing the work, so he knows. I think you see more individual actions like that than you do the structure. But the purpose of the army, it's a colonial army, right? That's most of its work. Americans aren't really fighting international wars. You're fighting Indians. And a lot of times the way we talk about it is even if you had political aspirations, let's say to be president, the best way to start that career is to join the military and kill Indians. That's what Jackson does. Lincoln does that. This is what you do to get into the federal government, into politics. It's the American enterprise, if you will. Yeah. Ben?
Can you talk a little bit more about relations between the Osage and other Indians?
Yeah, so they are not as popular with a lot of their neighbors as you might think because their expansion is displacing people, right? So the natives they're taking as slaves, obviously people dislike. So like if you think of Caddoan nations, Caddoan-speaking people really get pushed down further and further south because the Osage are expanding over them and taking their resources and displacing them, really. So they have plenty of enemies, which is why when the Cherokee move in, they cultivate all these Osage enemies as allies for themselves to try to displace them. Yeah, so this power isn't like universally beloved. Much like the Comanche Empire's power was not universally beloved. It is at the expense of other natives and their power. Yeah.
I'd like you to talk about this from a world history perspective because you made a comment that the American empire was much more efficient than the British or the French. And I'm taking settler colonialism to mean the settler part is the most important. Is it the actions of people not necessarily part of the government going out and moving on to land? Is land the key part of what makes them successful? And that's not what makes the British as successful in India or Australia or other places?
The argument is it's democracy. So because these settlers are squatting, and then they can, once there's enough of them, establish a territorial government, right? They can demand military protection first. And then they can, once there's enough of them, set up a territorial government, and that territorial government is responsive only to them. So that majority wields its power in the local government, which in some cases is more powerful even than the federal government. That's why the Indian agents in Kansas are like, they've got their own militias. The territorial governor thinks it's fine. I can't get anyone to do anything to help me because their sort of political power locally is the power. And the Osage are just like
monarchy like England or Spain, you wouldn't have quite the same expansion.
Correct.
as Britain was.
Correct. Yeah, you could have elites controlling for their own benefit the so-called rabble. Yeah. So, I mean, democracy is the problem. Yeah. Noah.
So, as I understand it, the French Empire became interested in the New World due to the fur trade. So, and you talked about the French entering the slave trade. What interest did they have?
Profit. Yeah, it's profit. Because the French in North America are pretty weak. The French in the Caribbean are making money, right? Haiti will become one of the most profitable colonies, and it's only half of an island, right? Because of the work it's doing. And in order to do that, it has to consume a massive amount of slaves because they literally work people to death. So the French aren't very powerful in North America, but they're extremely powerful and profitable in places like the Caribbean. Plus, a lot of the French people that colonize don't want to farm themselves, and they almost never need to because they're like, well, the natives will do it, so I'll just trade some stuff and get it, and then I don't have to farm myself. And then I don't really want to, clean my house myself either while I'm at it, or rear my children, right? So these ideas of status for them was less about farming your own piece of land and more about sort of having these trappings of status that slavery will do. And Africans will be used in this slavery too. It's just in this part of the continent, it's more indigenous slaves. Yeah, so money. Money is the reason. Yeah.
So after the Osage are kind of corralled out of their territory into a reservation, are they still, do they still identify as hunters and trappers? Like, for how long is that still a big problem?
Well, so like you mean once they're into Oklahoma, for example? Right, so like one of the things I point out, so I was telling you about that population decline that happens in Kansas. The reason why that population decline ends is entirely up to Osage leaders who finally force the federal government to give them the proceeds of their land sales from Kansas and allow them to divide it out amongst individual people so they can buy their own food. Because the land they live on in Oklahoma is sort of intentionally non-farmable. And there's a lot of arguments that they intentionally chose non-farmable land because that would be the land that settlers would want the least. And so then what they start doing is as soon as they can finally, and they have to really manipulate Indian agents to get this, as soon as they can have control over leasing on their land, they start leasing to cattle ranchers the outer edges of the reservation, right, for grazing purposes. And then they can collect an income off those grazing leases because it was pretty good grazing land. And these are ways that they try to make income in these places in resistance to sort of US policy. So remind me the question again. Have I gotten to it?
The question had to do with hunting.
Oh yeah, hunting as a, right.
Else as their life.
Right. So by the time, the argument I make is there are some successful buffalo hunts once they're into Oklahoma, but they're infrequent and not always successful. And so they end up not doing that as their primary method of income anymore. But people still try to grow crops. People still try to do other aspects of traditional culture, but these other forms of income like land sale, revenue, leasing, and then other forms of employment over time will be the way that, and that's why I argue Oklahoma is where it changes, right? It's where the religion and the economy change.
So one of the things that's going on there then is they go from an economy that's based on pelts being currency to
Right.
being a cash economy,
Correct.
which had to have been devastating.
Well, yeah, it's a transition. Yeah, absolutely. Now, some people argue that they were better equipped for that than other indigenous groups because they demanded, again, this is another sign of Osage leadership being extremely forward-thinking, that their land in Kansas be sold, not ceded. So if you cede land, the federal government only has to pay you for a period of time until they say they've paid you off. But if you sell the land, then the proceeds of those land sales should come to you. And the federal government held that money in the Treasury, of course, never intending to give it to the Osage. And lots of fraud is committed by the federal Treasury for other Indians in this context. But they finally demand access to the proceeds from those sales because they were right, people wanted it. and it was highly valuable. And then they get a higher dollar value from doing that than they would have from seeding. But either way, it's probably not what they would have gotten on the open market if they'd sold it themselves. Yeah, and then of course you probably know about oil, right, that comes to the Osage later, that's something that also leads to all kinds of violence and death, right? That, again, so anything that's good is inside the colonial context and can't really be totally good for an indigenous population. But yeah, then people can have access to education, right? That money can give access to other forms of education that they'll eventually consume, and other sort of choices that they can make that not all natives are gonna have. Some of those choices. But again, it should all be remembered that it's under colonial duress, right? Missionization and elimination is the goal. Yeah.
Yeah, just to take it a little bit further in your comments. You said that the Osage demanded from the federal government things like proceeds. Sales.
Yeah.
How did they go about this? Who represented the Osage to the federal government? What levers did they have?
Yeah, I'd have to look more at the political history. So there's lots of people who have written about this political history of the Osage, and I focus more on sort of its gendered implications. But they are very well aware of what Americans want, right? And so they are very well aware of how they can make certain demands that Americans might not care about at the time, right? Americans didn't think that the Osage were actually gonna ever get these profits, right? It's their own sort of astute ability to do that. But I'd have to look more at the scholarship on how they, particularly at those treaty negotiations, leveraged for that. Because I do know that it's under literally threat of death. I mean, they have people there threatening lives, and the Commissioner of Indian Affairs is threatening extermination at the last Kansas treaty. So I don't know if this was one of his ways to hurry up. Well, there was one other thing that happened in that treaty, and they tried to cede, railroad companies tried to get the Osage to cede the land directly to them, which is illegal. It had to be open for public access. And so that's the way the treaty was originally written, was that a railroad company would get access to the land first. So then Congress has to ratify treaties, right, the Senate? And the Senate refused to ratify that because that was fraud. And then they have even worse problems with squatting, because it looked like the treaty was approved, even though the Senate hadn't ratified it yet. So I don't know if I'd have to look up if it was a problem of that fraud, and this was a way of compensating them for the fact that it was even more overrun, and there was this railroad company that was trying to exploit the situation.
Is it safe to say that the government was probably betting on the natives to war with each other?
Oh, absolutely. It was intentional. Yeah, it is planned. Yeah, that if you concentrate groups of people on a smaller piece of land that need the natural resources for their economy, that this will lead to violence. Now, of course, Jefferson said publicly that this will teach them to farm a plot like an American would do, even though they're farming higher amounts of acreage than Americans will do once they get there, right? So yes, it was intentional. Yeah, and that's what this whole settler colonialism formula does. You can see it in other places in the world too. The proxy invader situation is intended to cause Indians to kill each other. Yeah.
Well, we can continue the conversation.
Yes.
Downstairs at the reception, books are on sale.
Yes.
The book, it's really, really interesting, and yeah, there's lots more.
Oh yes, yes, lots more. I had to leave it all out.
She
Yeah.
left quite
It was
a bit out.
difficult.
You
Yes.
got a lot in though.
Yeah, okay. Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you.